Tired of 3D printed leverless controllers? It's time to look at the Speedy Labs light fighting box, also known as the LightFox. This is a super small, super slim leverless controller, but the main difference is that instead of the plasticky construction, which is super common, this one is CNC machined aluminum. As you can see, it has customizable artwork as well, and a little screen to give you information about settings that you're changing. It may not be officially licensed if you want to play it on console, but if you have an adapter, this is a super reasonably priced controller at $120. There is an art printing service where you can get art that you submit printed and pre-installed into the controller before it arrives, and it also comes with this snazzy Speedy Labs case. It has Keychron optical switches installed as standard, but what is now considered a more basic leverless button layout. So is this fancy aluminum controller with light up RGB buttons the one for you? Let's find out. Just want to point out at the start that this controller was sent to me for the purposes of making this video free of charge, and I don't have to send it back at the end. All opinions are my own, and I haven't been instructed to say anything specific about it. Alright, as you can see here, I've got Street Fighter 6 booted up, and this, the LightFox controller, also known as the Light Fighting Box, and we do have the Tifa Lockhart art installed. Now we're going to go into detail about this controller, but remember I have a general video about all of these cheap leverless controllers, especially the ones using GP2040 firmware. So if you haven't seen that when you finish this review, you definitely want to check out that video next. I'll put a link in the description below. So the first things you probably want to see is how it actually feels to use in-game, and I'm happy to report that is basically exactly as you would expect. We've got nice key switches. These are Keychron optical switches. They've got a fair amount of tension, but they are sensitive enough. About halfway through the throw, they do actuate. Got left, down, right, and jump. So I can jump with my left thumb, or I can jump with my right thumb. This layout here in the middle allows me to do both light, medium, and heavy punch. And then I've got L1, which is set to drive impact, and light, medium, and heavy kick. And then I've got L2, which is set to parry, which obviously makes it super nice and easy to do things like drive rush or drive impact or whatever it is I need to do. Now, in terms of first impressions of the controller, the first thing I think you're going to notice is the weight of the controller. Because it's made of this aluminum, it's machined CNC aluminum, it's nice and weighty. Obviously not super important for a leverless controller because it shouldn't really be going anywhere if you're not wangling around a lever or anything. And in addition to having a metal body, it also has non-slip padding all over, so wait, hang on a second, all over the bottom. I had to zoom in for that, that's important. Something that's kind of interesting about the non-slip padding that they've chosen here is that it's really, really smooth, and so actually it doesn't really have a lot of that non-slip, those non-slip properties. So something that's kind of interesting about this is that it's quite difficult to shift it left and right, but something that it does do really easily is it shifts kind of, it spins around. I don't know, maybe if it's not very evenly applied, you might want to consider putting some rubber sort of non-slip pads here on the corners anyway. So first impressions go to the construction and the feel and quality of the device, but the next thing you're going to be checking out is the actual buttons themselves. And of course, like I mentioned before, these are optical switches. They feel perfectly fine to use. The layout is not quite what you might be used to. Of course, it looks very similar to most leverless layouts, and when I put my hand on it, you can see it feels very, very natural. No weird shift to the left or shift to the right. Just a top layer and then almost straight down a bottom layer as well. They all light up as well. There are LEDs on either side, and they do a very ample job of illuminating the button. It doesn't illuminate them very uniformly. In the current mode it's set to, it phases through all the different colors. You can see that as I press the buttons, it illuminates them, and actually if you press left and right at the same time, it actually switches them off to show that they're both being SOCD cancelled. Something I will say is that although I like these key switches and the layout is perfectly serviceable, it might not be exactly what you're used to, because as you can see, there's a slightly larger gap between the left and the middle button than there is between the middle and the right button. I can't 100% figure out why they may have done this. It might be that the distance from here to here is equal to the distance from here to here, but as you can see, just vertically, it just looks a little bit strange to have the buttons kind of slightly more spread out. We're talking about like 1 millimeter here, but you do kind of notice it You can also see that the buttons are just very widely spaced. It is ever so slightly spread apart, so you have to like spread your fingers out like this. You can see it's not causing any pain to my fingers, but because these are 20mm buttons, it seems like a missed opportunity to just shift them a little bit closer together. If you're used to playing on something like the Razer Kitsune, however, which also uses optical switches, you'll probably be just fine with this because that controller uses larger buttons. And so the spacing ends up being a little bit further apart anyway. If you have large hands, this might be perfect for you because it's got a slightly wider spread. Obviously, being super widely spaced, there's no issue with you kind of bumping into other buttons when you're double tapping. There's actually a screen right here. This is a pretty standard feature of the GP2040 CE firmware that most of these controllers are using to produce very cheap PCBs. But it's really nice, and actually a lot of companies that aren't using the GP2040 firmware, they don't have these little screens. So actually I really appreciate having this screen, and I don't think there are any buttons set up to change the turbo settings by default. You can obviously do that yourself in the web configurator, but usually that sort of information shows up here as well, how much delay you've got set when you use the turbo mode. You also get useful information like the fact that we're in X input mode. You can just see at a glance I'm in SOCD neutral mode. So actually, because we have this Final Fantasy VII artwork installed, we don't have any labels on here. I think there is another inlay, but I don't have an inlay like that, so I've actually got this bit of paper that came with the controller. I don't know. In a way, I'm kind of glad that they just cut the costs on things like these, but at the same time, I'm like, well, if you're going to charge someone $120, you should probably give them, I don't know, like a laminated card or a business card or maybe a little booklet, some sort of pamphlet. Instead, we got this extremely, it's like, we couldn't even have a whole A4 piece of paper. Personally, I'm not a big fan of just sending people QR codes that say scan me. I prefer if it actually says what website address it's going to send me to, because it's a little scary sending people to a website not knowing what's going to be automatically downloaded when you click on the link or anything. Something that's interesting about the manual, though, is it's a Google Doc, so it's not actually like printed out nicely on various web pages with icons and illustrations or anything. It's like, it's a Google Doc. You actually open up the doc, and I guess that makes it easier for them to update it, but as an end user, it's a bit of a weird experience. Like, why am I opening up this Google app in my browser, and like the images don't match up with my phone because you can't zoom in on the Google Doc unless I think maybe you have to be in editing mode. So just Google Doc as a way of delivering the manual is a little bit strange. But anyway, the information is there. The options button here, back, and then we've got the home button in the middle. We've got a touchpad button, and we've also got R3 and L3. Which brings me on to an important point. This controller does not have extra buttons. A lot of controllers, especially these ones using GP2040, they're automatically going for as many extra buttons as possible. So sometimes we have an L3 over here, an R3 over here, and maybe even the touchpad button is over here. There's a lot of flexibility with what you can do, but this is just a standard controller. I'm not going to dock points for that because personally, I don't really use the extra buttons. When I have them, I can like find uses for them, but especially in a game like Street Fighter 6, really all you need is just these 8 buttons, because you've got 3 punches, 3 kicks, and then you've got drive, impact, drive, rush. And really, you know, it would be nice sometimes to have the extra buttons, but personally the way I play the game is it doesn't really require any of those extra things anyway. Keep in mind though, for a controller of the same price or less, you could get a controller that does have extra buttons. I guess one of the benefits of not having too many extra buttons is that you've got more space for this beautiful artwork. Gotta say, kind of gutsy that they're shipping these controllers with artwork from Final Fantasy VII. I don't know, maybe have they got an official partnership with Square Enix? Anyway, some important information you should know. I'm playing on the PC version of the game. This is not the PlayStation version, and as such, I'm not having any issues with like timeouts or anything, but it is GP2040. So keep in mind that if you want to use a controller like this on PlayStation, you're going to have to buy one of those authentication devices. Maybe wondering what these 2 buttons are. They're actually not set to do anything by default, but they are both function buttons that are available to you to set to whatever you want. So, for example, if you wanted to set it as a function button so that you could run shortcuts, kind of strange that it's not actually set to do anything by default. That's a little bit of a missed opportunity. But again, I think this is the type of controller where it's assumed that you know what's going on with GP2040 firmware and you know what it's capable of, so you kind of buy the controller knowing that you can set it up however you like it. Something interesting you may have seen here is the player LED. So I have a green light here and 3 more LEDs, which presumably will light up when I'm player 2, player 3, or player 4. But I have to admit, I could not find a way to actually make these LEDs light up. I plugged it into a PlayStation using my brick adapter, couldn't, even if I was the second player, it didn't show up as player 2. And next to the player LEDs, we also have these 3 slider switches. Now, if you're a beginner, this can be a little bit tricky because they all look the same, but actually this slider here has 3 different positions, so I'm not a big fan of slider switches because getting it to be right in the middle position can be tricky. Anyway, and they're also really small. So in the full left position, you're in left stick. You can see it actually switches to an L to show you that you're controlling the left analog stick. Obviously, it won't be analog, it'll still be digital. Anyway, if I switch it back to the middle position, you can see it goes to D, and now I'm in digital pad mode. And if I put it on the right side, we've now got it in R mode, which is the right analog stick. The second slider controls your SOCD cleaning mode. So you've got the left version, which I believe is set to up. So if I actually go into the game, you can see by pressing down and up at the same time, I get up priorities. Then if I put it in the middle position, you can see it changes back to SOCD N, which is what we normally have where down plus up equals neutral. So instead of jumping, pressing down and up just leads me to just stand back up. And then the final SOCD mode, if I put it on the right, last input priority mode. Again, this is currently, if I'm not mistaken, not allowed by the Capcom rules, but who knows, there might be games that allow this. Basically, if you're holding left and you press right, you just end up going right. If you're holding right and then you press left, you end up going left. And last but not least, we've got a tournament lock switch, means that you won't be able to accidentally pause the game. It has deactivated this button by being active. And believe it or not, there is one more button here in the corner. It is the firmware button. Not 100% sure how necessary it is to have a firmware button. Most other controllers don't have this, but it's subtle, so why not have it? Another bonus feature of having an acrylic top panel is that from the side of the controller, you can see the total internal reflection does cause the light to bounce around the inside of the acrylic panel and make it all the way to the edges of the controller. Essentially, not a whole lot else to say. It's what you see is what you get, but there are not that many controllers that actually come with a metal construction and also optical key switches. There are a lot of controllers just opting for the standard key switches because, you know, that's the easiest one to find replacements for, but it is set up from the start to use optical key switches if that's what you want, and especially if you have tried maybe a Razer Kitsune and you're like, I like the feel of optical key switches, then actually this feels a lot like playing on a Razer Kitsune. In fact, the button spacing is also like a Kitsune, even though the buttons are much smaller. I guess what it really comes down to is, at this price point, what exact feature set are you looking for? Because this is similar to all the other GP2040 controllers out there, but it uses a standard layout. So if you're not happy with having all those extra buttons, you just want more space for an artwork controller, this is going to be right up your alley. I have to say that it's not sharp at all. It's got a beveled edge over here, which is nice, so it's not painful at all, but it's also not a rounded edge, so when you're playing at a desk, even though it's super thin, you know, you don't have no issue resting your palms on your desk. I mean, I don't recommend it, but if you do rest your palms on your desk to play, you're not going to have any issues because it's nice and slim. But it doesn't hurt here, but it is sort of a rough edge. Well, not a rough edge, it's a hard edge. Quite happy that it comes with an angled cable. A lot of controllers are coming with these right now, and it's funny, I've seen this idea before. Keyhole loop over here, which prevents the cable from being yanked out of the controller by accident. I think to summarize my thoughts on the LightFox from Speedy Labs, at $120, it's not an expensive controller by any means. It's very inexpensive, but it doesn't have those extra buttons which are shipping on other controllers of equal price range. If you're going to choose this controller, you should probably choose it because, one, you like the brand, you like the styling, you like the acrylic cover here on the top. It's nice. It's like it all the way to the edge. In fact, you even get the lights shining up on the edge because of the total internal reflection. You get other features I don't see in many other controllers. You've got the player LEDs, 2 extra function buttons. That's not common in a lot of other controllers. You've got these 3-way switches. I'm not a big fan of dip switches, but it's nice to have a tournament lock switch and, you know, physical actual switches that you can use without having to remember the shortcut for how do I change my SOCD mode. It's like, it's just got a switch. And in fact, it tells me on the screen what SOCD mode I'm in. So it's nice and easy to use. It's also got non-slip padding all over the bottom, even though it wasn't very functional. But the other thing is just that aluminium construction. It does make the controller feel significantly more premium than a lot of other stuff out there. So if you're the type of person who has been playing and you're finding that the controller is like shifting around too much because it's too light, then just simply having this controller being a little bit heavier, and actually I really like the length of it as well. Some controllers are just ever so slightly too short like this. This slight extra length like this makes it just the right size in terms of length, so it's not going to fall off your lap or anything. I think if I have any concerns, it's mostly that it's just not that beginner friendly. It does have documentation on the website, but it's through a Google Doc, and the first time I accessed it, it was through my phone, and the Google Doc doesn't really scale properly, so the images came up really blurry. If I check it on a standard PC browser, it looks just fine. Like all of these controllers using GP2040, a lot of the heavy lifting has been left to GP2040, so it's like, if you want to know how to do this feature or reconfigure using the web configurator, a lot of the instruction manual basically just says, go to the GP2040 website and they'll explain it for you there. So the heavy lifting is being done by a different website anyway, but really not a whole lot else to complain about. It's $120, it lights up, it runs your favorite community edition firmware, and it's got optical key switches and a heavy-duty construction. So if this is the specific finger spacing that you're looking for and you don't mind not having the extra buttons, then this might be the controller for you. Oh, and as a bonus, you also get this nice carrying case, which honestly is really nice because most of these controllers come in like a really cheap box and they don't have a case. So it's like, even at $120, usually a case will cost you like something like $10 or $15 anyway. So I think that's really nice that it includes the case. Listen, that's all for the Speedy Labs Light Fighting Box LightFox controller at $120. This is an incredible deal for a controller that is really rugged feeling and definitely feels a little bit more premium than the price would suggest. It's incredibly well thought out. It has nice round edges everywhere it needs to have them. And the fact that there's an art printing service where you can submit a file to have printed on the controller when it arrives to you is an extra bonus. Even if this is not exactly the feature set or layout that you've been looking for, definitely keep an eye on this company, Speedy Labs, because they have some great ideas packed into this controller. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Check out this video next if you absolutely love leverless controllers. I've been NihongoGamer. I'll see you real soon.